Alicia.
And I'm Sean.
And today we decided to speak about something called defense mechanisms. It's something that a lot of people experience, and whenever we are experiencing anxiety or unwanted feelings or emotions, defense mechanisms tend to arise to almost put distance between ourselves and the unwanted or uncomfortable feelings. So one defense mechanism that a lot of people I think are quite familiar with is one called denial. So you'll often, in television series everywhere, they speak about someone being in denial, and what that actually is it is one defense mechanism that comes in when feelings, let's say for example, if you experience feelings towards someone other than your partner, or you have negative feelings towards someone as well, then you might push that away because it seems threatening and it brings up anxiety if you have to acknowledge that feeling. So you push it away and you pretend like it doesn't exist for you, like it's something that you don't experience. So that's a common one. But then there are quite a few others, and I think it's helpful for people to be able to identify. Often we sort of lean towards certain defense mechanisms, and I think it's helpful for us to identify which of these we engage with, so that we can sort of acknowledge when it does arise and see what's actually happening underneath it.
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand when we talk about a defense mechanism, we have to understand that it is not something that we purposefully choose to exhibit. It's something that we learn over time. We start doing or adapting to situations, and the behavior that we see, the representation of you adapting to a specific threat, that is the defense mechanism itself. And there would be a variety of defense mechanisms, but it's important to understand which ones more or likely are you used to using, and trying to understand why we use these specific defense mechanisms.
And especially during a time like lockdown and with everything happening economically and globally at the moment, I think it's these defense mechanisms often become heightened, or we express them more frequently when we're in periods of stress or high anxiety or difficult sort of stages in our life. So another defense mechanism that often even people experience after severe trauma, whether that's even assault, like physical assault or sexual abuse or anything like that, is something called repression. And that is when people literally, acknowledging those experiences or emotions is so threatening and it's so overwhelming that they completely press it away, and it's something that happens unconsciously, so it's without us meaning to or trying to forget about it. We just repress it so much that we genuinely forget about it. When
we look at a situation like that, a person might be in a context where things come up and they're reminded of some memories or something unpleasant, and they don't necessarily know what it is, but they know there's an association to this, whether it's a smell or a familiar place or an unfamiliar place, but there's a reaction coming up. Again, this is very much unconscious. It's not something that the person wants to necessarily have or chooses to have as a defense against the potential threat. It's something that works for that personality, and we can't really determine what personality and what trauma will lead to what defense mechanism. It's actually quite an interesting study to try and find out, but regardless of all that, if you look at a defense mechanism, it's something that happens. It's almost like breathing. It happens without the person necessarily being aware of it or why it exists in the first place.
And I think it also gets almost triggered as a way to protect that individual. For example, with the example I gave of someone experiencing maybe physical abuse or sexual assault, for someone that is really threatening, dangerous emotions or memories to remember and to deal with and to face. So repression is there to keep that person safe, to forget those memories, push it away, so that you can go on functioning, so you can go on with daily life. So it is there for survival, but sometimes these become also quite damaging, and sometimes they kick in when it's not necessary. So for example, another defense mechanism that often happens in children, but it also happens in adults, is one called regression. And what that is basically it's regressing to a younger stage of development, like when you were younger in your life, it's going back to those behaviors. So often, again, a typical example is when children don't wet the bed, they're potty trained, everything, and then all of a sudden, often after severe trauma, they start bedwetting again. It can also happen in adults where they start to, sometimes people will almost use childlike voices. They will express themselves in a way that is quite characteristic of a child's way of expressing. They will have stoop posture, stand in a corner, sort of make themselves smaller as if when they were a child.
Yeah, it's also interesting to when we look at defense mechanisms, one person can exhibit or experience a trauma and exhibit, for example, denial or repression or suppression, and another person can experience a similar trauma and develop and express a completely different type of defense mechanism. It's very much individual to the person and the environment they grow up in. It's also, it's a response to a threat. These people and children, it happens when you are in childhood, whether the trauma is in childhood or later on in your life. It is there to try and protect the person. I've seen quite often where it only becomes prevalent as they get older, adults, because this is also when we start communicating more often with people. Within children, you might see it on physical behavior, but in terms of their verbal speech, it's actually quite difficult to pick up. They might be isolating or quite withdrawing from people. But when we start communicating more effectively, this is where we can pick up a lot of these defense mechanisms. And unfortunately, by then, it's been reinforced for so many years where they've now adapted to this hurt, if you will. And this defense mechanism has been there for many years to try and protect the organism, the child, the person. So it becomes really difficult to try and unravel for a lot of these individuals.
And because it happens unconsciously, it's also, if you don't have this knowledge, it's very difficult to identify it and bring about change if you're not even aware that it's happening in the first place. Another defense mechanism that I wanted to mention is one called reaction formation. So that's when you have that uncomfortable emotion or feeling or memory or something coming up, and instead of dealing with that, you create the exact opposite and you express that. So a very typical example is someone that's homosexual will then start expressing start making homophobic remarks or things like that. I've seen it in clients where they feel a certain way, but that's so uncomfortable for them to sit with that they completely, without meaning to and without trying to be deceptive or lying about it, they, instead of expressing that, they say they feel the exact opposite.
Exactly.
So I saw it the other day where someone, a family member said how they're sorry about something, and instead of acknowledging the fact that was so painful that happened, they say, oh no, it's fine, that didn't bother me. No, it's completely fine. It's reaction formation. It's the exact opposite of what they're actually feeling.
Yeah, it sometimes it's also sad because in moments like that where they can develop, a different type of connection with either the parent, partner, anyone else, they've been so used to responding in a specific way that in moments like that, they disregard what that meant to them or even how it affected them. It's in a way they want to be heard and want to be acknowledged, but when it does happen at times, they fail to recognize the importance of something like this because it's been reinforced for so long. It's very difficult to move away from something like that. I've seen quite effective, and to be effective in people, if they keep at it, if they are persistent, in a way training the person, helping the person to do it consecutively, not just every now and then. It's a concept that needs to be addressed over a long period of time. Your behavior is something that doesn't just change overnight. And this essentially is a response to a threatening situation in society. And that is essentially behavior, and it takes a long time to correct or to get to a stage where, you know, adapting to what's really going on around you is better for yourself, better for your interpretation and understanding. Because a lot of times we interpret the situation because of the defense mechanism in a way that is not conducive to our happiness or our relationship. And that becomes even more pressure that's placed on the system.
And another one I want to mention is intellectualization. And that is when we, instead of focusing on the emotion associated with a certain event or memory, we focus on almost moving it to the cognitive. Instead of feeling the emotion, we start intellectualizing it, thinking about it, getting facts to support it. So that also is, let's say for example, if you go through maybe physical abuse with a parent, instead of being able to acknowledge how difficult that experience was for you, you would start looking at facts. No, my mother did go to my school meeting, or she did try her best, or no, my father, he just had a mental illness, or he used substances and that's why he wasn't there for me, or that's why he was abusive. And it's looking at facts, intellectualizing whatever happened instead of focusing on the emotion.
Yeah, I see this a lot with my clients as well, specifically when we work with partners in a system, and oftentimes people like this, they struggle to communicate effectively. And what sometimes happens when we have a intellectualization as a defense mechanism happening, we have one partner, be it male or female, it doesn't really matter. One partner will experience and potentially express emotion, and the other partner will disconnect from that emotion because potentially that emotion is quite dangerous. They've learned over time in their life that if I get too close to people, I might be injured. It might hurt me a lot more. So they instead of actually hearing the emotion, what the other partner says, they would, for example, start picking at the abstract things, the logical things. For example, one of the most recent arguments I've had or heard with some of my clients, they would say, you know, one partner would say to the other one, you always do this. And the one thing that the other partner will focus on is not what his or her partner is saying, but the fact that they are always doing it. And they start picking at that and saying, you know what, I don't always do this. I don't always say this. And that's not the point. And that is when we start disconnecting from the actual emotion in the moment, because it's somewhat scary. It's a discomforting feeling. We don't know how to process and sit with that emotion. It's almost like this person is, you know, angry with me, and it's bringing up a lot of emotion, and I don't know how to deal with that. So I would disconnect into intellectualization, or sometimes even normalization, where they would use that as a defense mechanism, where they don't acknowledge necessarily what happened to them as you know, as it really did, because other people have experienced worse, and because other people have experienced worse, my story is not that important, and we should rather let it go.
Definitely. I also see that a lot in the clients that we work with. And the thing is that often that sort of engaging in that way is unhelpful, because those experiences are still so difficult for them. But now they're not expressing that to the people in their lives, because they constantly almost devalue it and take away the fact that that was a valid, difficult experience that they went through. So the last one that I want to mention is something called sublimation. And that is actually, it's often seen as the most positive defense mechanism, or healthiest defense mechanism. And that is when people take that energy of, let's say for example, I have with someone at work, I have an argument with them and I'm so angry, but then I go home and I exercise, or I paint, or I create something. So instead of putting it on someone else, I sort of put that energy into a healthy activity. Absolutely.
I think it's important to understand that defense mechanisms can be positive. It is, if you compare it to other defense mechanisms, it can be more positive, at least for the person in the moment, than other defense mechanisms where, in a way, we are pushed away from other people. So by all means, defense mechanisms can be positive. And I think all defense mechanisms, if you think about it, in that moment in time it's positive,
serve a function.
exactly, for that person, but not necessarily serving a function in the relationship as a greater aspect. Sublimation is one of those things where it's a social acceptable activity that we engage in, either exercising, and it by no means does it mean the energy is completely gone, because those thoughts might still remain with the person, but at least enough energy is gone so that it doesn't constantly bother that person. But by acting on it continuously, you reinforce that this is the only way that I can deal with this specific or particular problem. And it is not.
Yeah, and I think that even with sublimation, that often it's also not helpful for you to go and exercise or go and create and never express the emotion. And I think that's what you were also touching on, is the fact that that emotion still needs to be expressed.
Yes.
That conversation still needs to be
Exactly.
had. So one other defense mechanism, sorry, I just want to add as well, which I think is quite important and I forgot to mention it, is displacement. And that is where, instead of, let's say I have an argument with my boss, instead of expressing that anger towards that person, I go and I displace it, I put that energy onto a less threatening object or person. So maybe I will have an argument at work and I'll go home and I'll kick the dog, or I'll be abusive towards my child, or oftentimes people use substances. They put that energy, they almost redirect that energy into a bottle or into a substance, which often, as we say, that might release some of the anxiety in the moment, but it's not an effective solution because the original problem is still not addressed. And I think that with all of these defense mechanisms, it's helpful to understand which ones we engage with, and to look at the underlying emotion and still express that, communicate that, work through it, instead of just sort of avoiding and deflecting from it.
Yes, absolutely. We hope that this concept of defense mechanisms helps you understand it a bit more, and also maybe identifying it within yourself, in your patterns of communicating going forward. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section below, and we'll try and get to it as soon and as effectively as possible.